Life has a way of changing in an instant. One moment, you're 32, happily married, and planning your future. The next, you're a widow deciding on cremation options because your husband's body was too damaged for an open casket funeral. That's what happened to me, Rachel. 6 months ago, my husband Kevin died in a car accident, leaving me in a world where nothing made sense anymore. It's astonishing how the world kept moving while mine stood still, shattered to its core. For weeks, I felt like I was living in a fog: funerals, phone calls, legal matters. Everything blurred together into a relentless cycle of tasks that needed to be done. If it weren't for my parents, I don't know how I would have managed. Rachel, sweetheart, we've made all the arrangements with the funeral home, my mom said gently, her voice filled with a tenderness I'd never heard before. Just focus on yourself, okay? I nodded gratefully, though her words were little more than a faint echo in my mind. How could I focus on myself when myself no longer existed? Kevin had been my life, and without him, I felt like an empty shell. A grief support group became my lifeline. Every Tuesday evening, I found myself among others who shared my pain. We sat in a room with faded wallpaper, surrounded by tear-streaked faces and strained smiles. It was a place where grief didn't need to be explained. One evening, I gathered the courage to speak, though my voice barely rose above a whisper. Sometimes I wake up and, for a split second, I forget he's gone, I murmured, afraid to meet anyone's eyes. Maria, a woman in her 40s who had lost her husband 2 years ago, reached out and took my hand. Her touch was warm, almost maternal. That's normal, sweetheart. Grief comes in waves, she said, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. As the months went by, life forced me to face practical matters. Kevin had left me enough money to live comfortably: a suburban house, an apartment downtown, and a substantial bank account. I even had the option to quit my job, but the thought of sitting in an empty house all day was unbearable. Instead, I switched to part-time work, just to keep my mind occupied. The most unexpected change was in my relationship with my parents. Growing up, I had always felt overshadowed by my younger sister, Sarah. Mom and Dad never missed her dance recitals or school plays, while my academic achievements barely earned a well done. But after Kevin's death, something shifted. When my parents asked for financial help, $500 a month, I agreed without hesitation. That money meant nothing to me, but it was a real lifeline for them. Our weekly dinners became a new tradition. Mom would make her signature roast, Dad would pour the wine, and we'd talk about everything and nothing. For the first time in my life, I felt like they truly saw me. Rachel, tell us more about that new project you're working on, Dad said one evening, genuinely interested in my stories about marketing campaigns. It was a strange but pleasant feeling to be the center of attention. But everything changed one night when Sarah joined us. She walked in, 7 months pregnant, her rounded belly instantly drawing everyone's attention. Sarah had always known how to command a room, it was just who she was. We hadn't seen each other since Kevin's funeral, so her arrival was unexpected. "Sarah, honey, sit right here," Mom fussed, practically pushing me out of my seat. "Do you need another pillow? How are your feet? Are they still swelling?" I watched the scene unfold as if from a distance. My parents hovered over Sarah like she was a queen in need of care and adoration. Suddenly, I was invisible again, like someone had flipped a switch, turning off the light that had briefly shone on me. All their attention was on Sarah, her pregnancy, her life. Sitting on the edge of my chair, I silently observed as everything reverted to how it used to be. Her happiness and her successes overshadowed everything else. The familiar ache of being overlooked crept back into my heart. It felt like an old friend I'd foolishly hoped I'd left behind, but here it was, as strong as ever. During dinner, I tried to insert myself into the conversation by asking Sarah a question that had been on my mind for a while. "So, who's the father?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, as if it were casual curiosity. "Have you told him about the baby?" Sarah paused mid-motion, her fork suspended in the air. For a moment, her face darkened. "That's none of your business," she snapped, her tone icy as she resumed pushing peas around her plate. "I don't have to share every detail of my personal life." Her words were sharp, but I was used to this kind of tone from her. Before I could respond, Mom jumped to her defense. "Rachel, don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong," she said without even glancing at me. "Your sister doesn't owe anyone an explanation." I couldn't help but recall how differently they had behaved when I was undergoing infertility treatment. Back then, my parents had no doubt that they were entitled to demand updates and give unsolicited advice about my personal life. That comparison stuck in my mind as I listlessly picked at the stew on my plate. At the next family dinner, I couldn't hold back again. "And how exactly do you plan to manage on your own?" I asked, watching Sarah's reaction closely. Her plate was piled high with food, and that familiar smirk, the one that had always infuriated me, returned to her face. "Don't worry about my baby," she said dismissively, waving a hand as if to brush my concern aside. "We don't need anything from anyone." Instead of reassuring me, her words set off alarm bells in my head. But I stayed silent. That smirk. I had seen it too many times before. Sarah always found new shortcuts, which inevitably led to dead ends. I remembered her organic smoothie business that had shut down after 2 weeks. Then there was her life coaching certification course, which she never completed, and the lost money in cryptocurrency investments that left her months behind on rent. "Trust me, this time it's different," she said, patting her belly with the confidence of someone who had already conquered the world. "Everything's going according to plan." Dad looked at her with a proud smile, as if she had just discovered the cure for cancer. "That's my girl, always landing on her feet," he said, conveniently forgetting her track record. I took another bite of the stew, forcing myself to swallow both the food and my bitterness. The familiar feeling of being the second choice, the second best, washed over me again. Some things never change, I thought, watching my parents hang on Sarah's every word. On Tuesday morning, as I sat at my desk reviewing marketing reports, my phone rang. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. I nearly sent the call to voicemail. Our conversations were usually short and awkward, but something made me pick up. "Rachel," her voice was saccharine sweet, the tone she only used when she wanted something. "What's going on?" I asked, already bracing for a request. "There's going to be a baby shower for Mom and Dad this weekend. I'd really love for you to come," she said, her voice carrying a forced cheerfulness. I froze, unsure how to respond. The last time we'd had a real heart-to-heart conversation had been at Kevin's funeral. Even then, she had seemed distracted and strangely detached. "Are you sure?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "Of course," she said with a laugh that sounded unnatural. "You're my only sister. It wouldn't be a real celebration without you." I nodded, as if she could see me through the phone. "Fine, I'll come," I said, already mentally running through gift ideas I could bring. Her final comment caught me off guard. "I have something special for you," she said. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. But I brushed the feeling aside, convincing myself that this might be her way of bridging the gap between us. The following Saturday, I arrived at our parents' house carrying 2 carefully wrapped packages, a baby monitor in one and a handmade blanket in the other. Despite our differences, I still wanted to give something meaningful for my future niece or nephew. It felt like the right thing to do. As I walked into the house, I was hit by a wave of pastel colors. Pink and blue balloons hung from the ceiling, ribbons adorned the furniture, and a centerpiece cake made of diapers wrapped in ribbons stood proudly on the table. The whole scene looked like a baby boutique had exploded. Trust Sarah to put on a spectacle like this. It seemed like she had invited half the town. Aunt Margaret was there with her daughters, Mom's bridge club friends were perched on the couch, and Sarah's former college neighbors were huddled around the punch bowl, giggling loudly. Amid the chaos, Sarah made her entrance, weaving through the crowd in a flowing maternity dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She radiated the glow of an expectant mother, but there was something predatory in her smile, as if she were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her gaze crossed mine more than once, lingering just a bit too long, and it made me feel increasingly uneasy. We played the usual baby shower games, guessing the size of her belly with a piece of string, placing bets on the baby's due date, and even that ridiculous melted chocolate in a diaper game. To my surprise, I won the contest for correctly guessing the size of her belly. That seemed to irritate Sarah more than I had expected. Her smile grew tighter, and her strange glances in my direction became more frequent. After all the games, it was time to open the gifts. Sarah unwrapped each box in turn, letting out theatrical gasps of delight at every onesie and bottle. When it came to my blanket, she held it up as though showcasing a masterpiece. Her fingers traced the intricate pattern, and she nodded approvingly. Then, raising her glass, she toasted to an imaginary audience, drawing the attention of all the guests. The room fell silent. My heart began to race, and suddenly the air felt thick, syrupy. It was hard to breathe. "I want to thank everyone for coming today," she began, resting a hand on her belly like an actress who knew the entire audience was captivated. "But I have something to share. I think it's time everyone knew who the father of my child is." The room full of guests froze, and I felt myself seize up inside. Sarah's eyes locked with mine, and I realized I already knew what she was about to say. Every second of her silence was agony, but nothing could prepare me for the impact of her words. "The father," she announced, her voice slicing through the quiet, "is Kevin Wilson, Rachel's late husband." The world tilted sideways, as if I were standing on the edge of an abyss. A deafening roar filled my ears, drowning out everything else. All I could see was Aunt Margaret clutching her hand to her mouth, Sarah's college friends huddled together, whispering furiously. But what struck me most was the lack of surprise on my parents' faces. They knew. They had known all along. I was paralyzed, unable to move or speak. Sarah was already continuing, her voice triumphant as it filled the room. "And since this child is Kevin's only heir," she said, addressing everyone but speaking directly to me, "I'm entitled to half of everything he left you, Rachel. The house, the apartment, the money. My child deserves their father's inheritance." Her words hit me like a shockwave. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was an earthquake that shook my very foundation, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. Sarah stood before me, radiating false triumph, as if she had won a game she had carefully orchestrated. The room spun, and I instinctively grabbed the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, as though I were teetering on the edge of a cliff. But even that wasn't enough to prepare me for what happened next. Mom and Dad stepped forward, positioning themselves on either side of Sarah like loyal bodyguards. Their faces were serious, their expressions resolute. "Rachel," my father began in a stern, almost businesslike tone, "you need to do the right thing. Your nephew deserves his father's inheritance." My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would break through my ribcage. Forcing myself to speak, I managed to choke out, my voice hoarse and barely audible. "You're lying. You're all lying. Kevin would never." I stopped, swallowing the lump in my throat. "He would never." Sarah stared at me with contempt, her smile growing colder and colder. Finally, she pulled her phone out of her pocket and triumphantly held it up, the screen facing me. "And how do you explain this?" she asked, her voice dripping with venom. I froze, my body refusing to obey me. On the screen was a photo. Kevin and Sarah were embracing, their faces close, their lips locked in a kiss. In the background was a hotel room, neutral territory, unmistakably intimate. In another photo, they were holding hands, sitting in a cozy restaurant I didn't recognize. He loved me, Sarah continued, her voice ringing out in the room like a bell. He was going to leave you for me. We wanted to tell everyone. But then, she paused, letting out a shaky sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Then the accident happened, and all our plans fell apart. Her voice trembled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. In any other situation, I might have believed this display of grief, but now I could only see it as theater. I couldn't listen anymore. I couldn't stay in that room, couldn't breathe the same air. My mind seemed to switch to autopilot. My body moved on its own. I grabbed my purse, pushed past the whispering guests, and rushed out the door. Rachel, my mother's voice, heavy with reproach, called after me, but I was already getting into my car. The drive home was a blur, as if I were moving through a fog. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as my thoughts kept circling back to those photos, trying to make sense of them. The restaurant in the picture must have been one of the places where Kevin claimed to have business dinners. And the hotel room photos, they must have been taken during one of his frequent work trips. When I finally got home and locked the door behind me, my phone started vibrating. Sarah wasn't wasting any time. She was sending me dozens of messages, screenshots of their conversations that now felt like something out of an alternate reality. I don't love her anymore. I can't see us together anymore. We'll tell everyone after the divorce. You're the only one I want to be with. I can't wait to start our life together. Message after message. Each one felt like a fresh stab to the heart. I couldn't help but look at the timestamps. The conversations had started months ago. They were planning their future together while I was undergoing infertility treatments, torturing myself with the thought that I was the problem in our marriage. That night, I aimlessly wandered through the house. My hands brushed against Kevin's belongings, his books, his shirts, the watch on his nightstand. Everything that had once brought me warmth and comfort now felt like symbols of betrayal. Had our entire life together been a lie? Or just this part of it? But which part? At exactly 7 a.m., the phone rang. It was my father. I let it ring 4 times before picking up. "Rachel, you need to be reasonable," he said, not even bothering with a greeting. I didn't respond, waiting for him to continue. "The sooner you agree to split the inheritance, the easier it will be for everyone." There was something cold and detached in his voice, as though he were discussing abstract figures and not the life of his own daughter. His words made my blood boil. "Easier for whom?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "For Sarah. For you. For all of you." Before my father could respond, my mother cut in. "Rachel, sweetheart, you have to understand. Sarah is expecting a child right now. We all need to support her." I closed my eyes, fighting back the scream rising in my chest. They had me on speakerphone when the word slipped out of my mouth. "When did you find out about them?" I asked, my voice barely louder than a whisper. A long, heavy pause followed. That silence said more than any excuse ever could. We've known for some time," my mother finally said, her voice trembling as if she couldn't decide whether to sound firm or compassionate. "How long?" I asked. "Kevin confided in us about 6 months before," her voice faltered. "Before the accident." 6 months. I nearly dropped the phone when she said it. The timeline hit me like a physical blow to the chest. 6 months. All that time, they had known. They knew about him and Sarah while I cried on their shoulders at his funeral. They knew while they accepted my monthly financial support, letting me fund their lives as if I were some kind of benefactor. "Traitors," I said, the word cold and final, like a sentence passed. "All of you." Before they could protest, I hung up. My hands shook as I blocked their numbers, but I didn't hesitate. Then I opened my banking app and, with a decisiveness I hadn't felt before, canceled the monthly transfers. Let them ask Sarah for money now. The next 2 weeks passed in a fog. Missed calls, ignored messages. Sometimes the phone vibrated so much I just turned it off, unwilling to hear the sound that reminded me of their betrayal. Then came Sarah's letter. An email, cold and businesslike, just like her. She threatened to sue me if I didn't voluntarily give up half of Kevin's inheritance. Voluntarily. That word, written with dry politeness, felt like a curse. I couldn't bring myself to respond. I couldn't bear the thought of this nightmare stretching on any longer. My mind kept replaying Kevin's betrayal and the realization that so many people must have known about him and Sarah while I remained oblivious. The pitying looks from coworkers at the office became unbearable. Sometimes I caught them exchanging glances and whispering behind my back. During one morning meeting with a client, I couldn't hold it together. The words stuck in my throat, and I simply walked out of the room, leaving confusion in my wake. Later, my boss, Tom, called me into his office. He was one of the few people who genuinely cared about me. "Rachel," he said gently, "you need time off. Paid, unpaid, whatever you want. The work will be here when you're ready to come back." I nodded, grateful for the chance to step away, and packed up my things that same day. At home, I barely left the house. I ordered groceries for delivery, ignored the doorbell, and spent hours poring over old photographs. I stared at each one, searching for signs I should have noticed but somehow missed. Every happy memory now felt like a cruel joke. Had it all been a lie? Then, I saw the news on Facebook. Sarah had given birth to a baby boy. In the photo, she was lying in a hospital bed, glowing with happiness. Mom and Dad hovered over the baby, their faces radiating pride. A chill ran through me as I noticed that the infant was wrapped in the cream-colored blanket I had knitted for her baby shower. It was a deliberate jab, there could be no doubt about that. I managed to close the app before reading the comments, but one look at the caption was enough. She had named him Kevin. A week later, a summons arrived. A thick manila envelope lay on my kitchen table. My hands trembled as I opened it, but there was nothing inside I hadn't anticipated. Sarah was suing me, demanding half of everything Kevin had left me. The legal language was cold, precise, and merciless. The document outlined her demands: the house, half the money, partial ownership of the downtown apartment. I stared at the text, unable to fully believe this was really happening. Every word felt like a blow, forcing me to relive the weight of her betrayal over and over again. I spent 3 days searching for a lawyer, carefully reviewing recommendations and testimonials before settling on Richard Martinez. He came highly recommended for his expertise in handling complex inheritance cases. I needed someone who could go toe-to-toe with Sarah's cunning manipulations. "Ms. Wilson," he began, flipping through the papers on his desk, his expression carefully neutral, "I need to be honest with you. Your sister has compelling evidence of her long-term relationship with your late husband." I felt every muscle in my body tense. "What kind of evidence?" My voice was tight, as though I were bracing for the answer. "Text messages, photographs, witness statements, including your parents' testimonies," he said, pausing to adjust his glasses. My stomach churned. In inheritance cases, such evidence, combined with the existence of a biological child, often garners sympathy from the court. "I want you to be prepared for what could be a lengthy and challenging process." I sat there, gripping the armrests of the chair, his words echoing in my head. Each fact was another blow, tearing down the remnants of my faith in fairness. When I returned home, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "This is Rachel Wilson," I answered. "Hello, Rachel," came a woman's voice. It was unfamiliar, but something in her tone put me on edge. "My name is Elizabeth Parker." My heart skipped a beat. Kevin, he told me his parents were dead, I whispered. He said he was an orphan. A bitter laugh sounded on the other end of the line. I'm afraid that was one of his many lies. We need to meet. There's something you need to know. We arranged to meet the next day at a small cafe downtown. The place felt neutral enough. I arrived early, my stomach twisted with anxiety. I ordered coffee but couldn't bring myself to take a sip. When the door opened, I nearly dropped the cup in my hands. The resemblance was uncanny. Kevin had her eyes, her smile. Even her posture, the same fluid confidence that had always captivated me about him. We sat in a quiet corner of the cafe, far from prying ears. Elizabeth watched me closely, as though gauging how far she could push. I was at the funeral, she said quietly. Standing at the back, dressed in black, with a veil. I remembered her. A solitary figure who had appeared at the church and disappeared before the service ended. At the time, I had been too consumed by grief to question who she was. Why are you coming to me now? I asked, trying to mask the suspicion in my voice. Because I've heard what your sister is claiming. And because I can't allow another woman to suffer for my son's lies, she said, her voice full of bitterness but not malice. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn manila envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she slid it across the table to me. This might help you. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside were medical records from Boston General Hospital, dated 10 years earlier, a year before Kevin and I got married. My eyes scanned the lines, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Complete azoospermia. Permanent sterility. I read those words over and over, but their meaning refused to sink in. Kevin, I started, but my voice failed me. Elizabeth watched me, her gaze full of understanding. He was devastated by the results, she said softly. I remember him sitting in that clinic, staring at the doctor in disbelief. For a man, especially for Kevin, that was a crushing blow. He knew he couldn't have children, I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Yes, she confirmed. But he would never admit it to anyone except me. Not even to himself. My thoughts spun in a dizzying spiral. If Kevin knew about his sterility, how could Sarah claim that her child was his? It was one of the last conversations Kevin and I had before our fight. The memories came flooding back, cutting through time like a knife. I couldn't speak. All those years of infertility treatments, endless visits to doctors, painful hormone injections, tears, and self-blame, it had all been a cruel charade. He had known. He had known from the start that we would never be able to conceive naturally. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed. Sarah sat in the front row, cradling baby Kevin Jr. in her arms. Like an actor on a stage, our parents flanked her on either side, a living shield radiating support and protection. Sarah was perfectly dressed, a modest black dress, barely their makeup, the carefully crafted image of a grieving woman. It was clear she had planned every detail to elicit sympathy. When she was called to the stand, she played her part masterfully. Her voice trembled, her eyes glistened with tears. All I want, she declared, her voice breaking in just the right places, is what's fair for my son. He deserves his father's legacy. The gallery seemed moved to its core. Some women even sniffled, visibly affected by her story. My lawyer, Mr. Martinez, patiently waited for Sarah to finish. Then he rose from his seat, his movements deliberate and almost leisurely, like a man who already knew how the game would end. Your Honor, he began, I would like to present evidence that Miss Thompson's claim is fraudulent. He approached the judge and handed over Kevin's medical records. I watched as the judge examined the documents carefully. Her expression remained calm, but the air in the courtroom grew heavy, like the stillness before a storm. Sarah's lawyer jumped to his feet, objecting. Your Honor, we challenge the authenticity of these documents. Their source is dubious. Sarah couldn't maintain her composure. Her face twisted in fury. These records are fake, she shouted, clutching the baby tighter. She forged them to steal my son's inheritance. Martinez didn't flinch. Your Honor, he continued calmly, given that the medical records confirm Mr. Wilson's absolute sterility, we request a DNA test to establish paternity. Sarah's triumphant smile returned. That's impossible, she declared, her voice too loud. Kevin was an orphan, and his body was cremated. There's no one left to test. Actually, Martinez said, gesturing toward the gallery, there is. All heads turned in the direction he was pointing. I would like to introduce Elizabeth Parker, the biological mother of Kevin Wilson. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Elizabeth rose to her feet. Even from where I sat, I could see Sarah's face turn pale, as if all the blood had drained from her cheeks. I am willing to undergo a DNA test, Elizabeth said firmly, to determine whether this child is my grandchild. The judge nodded. A DNA test is ordered. We will reconvene once the results are available. Sarah swayed slightly in her seat, her eyes darting from the judge to Elizabeth to the baby in her arms. Our mother rushed to her side for support, shooting me a glare filled with hatred as she passed. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. On the day the judge opened the envelope with the results, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Sarah sat motionless, her face drained of all emotion. Kevin Jr. slept peacefully in her arms, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around him. The judge unfolded the document and read the results, her voice steady and clear. The DNA test indicates that there is no genetic relationship between the minor child and Mrs. Elizabeth Parker. Therefore, Kevin Wilson cannot be the biological father of this child. A collective gasp swept through the room, as if everyone had been holding their breath at once. Sarah sat in a daze, her hands rocking the baby mechanically, though she didn't even glance at him. Her face was lifeless, as if the news had stripped away her last shred of control over the situation. I watched her, feeling something shift inside me. It wasn't victory, nor was it joy. It was something quieter, warmer, like the first star piercing through the night sky. Sarah's face twisted as she began to sob. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, turning her face into a mask that bore no trace of her former confidence. Miss Thompson, the judge's voice was sharp and unyielding, like cold steel. Can you explain why you committed this fraud in court? Sarah clutched the baby tighter, her shoulders shaking with sobs that felt more theatrical than genuine. I was seeing a few men around the time Kevin passed, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. When he was cremated. I thought no one would ever find out. Her sentence hung unfinished in the air. The judge leaned forward, her brow furrowed. No one would find out what, Miss Thompson? That the baby isn't his, Sarah finally confessed, her voice fading into an echo. I needed security for my child. So you tried to deceive your own sister, the judge asked, her voice devoid of sympathy. You used your parents as unwitting accomplices in this fraud? I just wanted to provide for my son, Sarah whimpered, but her voice had lost all its strength. I glanced at my parents. Even they looked stunned, their faces pale, their eyes darting around as if they were only now comprehending the magnitude of the lies. The judge's ruling was swift and unequivocal. This court rules in favor of the defendant, Mrs. Rachel Wilson. All claims on Kevin Wilson's estate by Sarah Thompson are dismissed with prejudice. She paused, her gaze cold and severe. Miss Thompson, you're fortunate that Mrs. Wilson has not pressed criminal charges against you for attempted fraud. Sarah looked as though the judge had just delivered a death sentence. When I stepped out of the courthouse, my parents were already waiting for me on the steps. My mother was crying, her face worn and haggard. My father looked older than I'd ever seen him. "Rachel, sweetheart," my mother began, reaching a hand toward me. We had no idea Sarah was lying. "We can make this right. We truly tried." "Don't," I interrupted, raising my hand. My voice was calm but firm. Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone and blocked their numbers right in front of them. Then I turned and walked away without looking back. Elizabeth was waiting by my car. She looked both composed and concerned. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, searching my eyes. I surprised myself by laughing. It was a strange, unexpected laugh, but it was real. "Do you know how I feel?" I said, looking at her. "Like I'm learning how to be myself all over again." I took a deep breath, my thoughts drifting briefly to the downtown apartment Kevin had left me. "I never liked it," I said. "Too many memories, too much pain. But maybe you'll like it." Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise. "Rachel, no, I couldn't possibly accept." "Please," I insisted. "You gave me my life back with those medical records. Let me give you something in return." When I handed her the keys a week later, she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I never thought I'd have a daughter," she whispered, hugging me tightly. 3 months have passed. My family is still trying to reach me through mutual friends and distant relatives, but I've severed those final threads. Sarah sent a letter, begging for forgiveness and help with her baby. I threw it away without opening it. Now, I have weekly dinners with Elizabeth. We are getting to know each other through stories about Kevin, the good and the bad. She's helping me understand that, despite his lies, the happy moments we shared were real. Yesterday, I finally packed up the last of Kevin's things. Elizabeth helped me donate some to charity, and we stashed the rest in the attic. As we worked, she told me stories about Kevin as a child, before the lies began. It helped, knowing that version of him existed. I'm not ready for new relationships yet, but I've started living again. I've returned to full-time work, joined a hiking club, and even planned my first solo vacation. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I barely recognize the woman staring back at me. Life has a way of surprising you. I lost the family I was born into, but found a new one. This isn't the life I planned, but maybe it's exactly the life I was meant to have.